Yeah. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So just by way of kicking us off. So here we are in the third of our 4 sessions. Today's emphasis looking particularly at nations. So let me just share this slide to start with. Just have a moment. Look at these 2 images side by side. Give some thought to what you see. So let me share a little. So the image on the right-hand side of the screen shows a number of flags, little circular flags, allocated into a structure that FIFA has given for the World Cup. So we can see the respective groups that the Kingdom is in, Group H, as you well know, and Group K, which is just scrolled off the bottom, which England are in. We can see where our friends from Brazil are in Group C, the USA in Group D, etc., etc. It's an image in various forms that you, I'm sure, will have seen before, whichever sport you may be particularly engaged with. It is a way of representing nations through the use of a flag, a symbol. Good afternoon, Yara. Thanks for joining. And this series of flags are organized by way of a structure from a governance body. So to hark back to last session, we looked at questions of governance, and FIFA came up, of course, and it demonstrated the role that that organization, like many others, has in its organizing its competition and what that does to the nature of the representation that we see. So these are nations that are represented through the use of their flag. The image on the left-hand side of the screen shows some of the same things and some different things. So I will point to the things that are the same to start with. So the same 48 nations are represented. Much of the same colour schemes are evident. The World Cup trophy is presented in both images. But there are also some key differences. Most obviously, and this is not a secret by any stretch, we see the players. So the centrality of the flag in itself has been altered in this image for the players making up the teams that are competing in this 48-team FIFA Men's World Cup. And because we see the images of the players, we may recognize some more than others. We can see some of their expressions. We can see some of the emotion on their faces. We can see some of the excitement. We can see some smiles. We can perhaps make a few assumptions about the nature of those players, all of which shape the way in which our understanding of those nations takes place. And then peeling back one more layer, what we see here is 48 nations represented at this FIFA Men's World Cup, out of 193 nations that are represented at the United Nations, for example. So we see different sovereignties, different jurisdictions in understanding what the nation is. And during the course of today's class, we're going to spend a fair bit of time thinking about nations and representation and what they mean to us and how they are perceived. So just hold those 2 overlapping but distinct versions of exactly the same information. 48 member competing countries, represented by players and by flags in its simplest form. So our scope for today, again, I'd like to offer up some opportunity for reflections on your behalf, see what you've been thinking about in recent days, and then thinking about understanding nations, what that looks like. Then we'll turn to different nations and different approaches and what that means, particularly in the world of sport. And we'll come on to this notion that I've spoken about elsewhere in terms of diplomats in tracksuits and what the world of sport does when we're talking about representation. And then we'll talk a little bit about the assessment. Just to add there, thank you all for sharing your assessments on Monday. Very much appreciated. I haven't had the chance to look at them as of yet, but I will do, and I'll get those back to you as soon as possible. So, with no apology for a sense of deja vu, I share with you again the module aims. These are the things that we're working towards, particularly relevant today, obviously concepts of national sovereignty and that relationship between sport and the world in which we live. Likewise, those learning outcomes really driving down perhaps onto the third of them, exploring the values and opportunities that align sport with nations and identities. Now we'll look a little bit greater depth about identity next time around, but thinking around how we utilize sport and its relationship with nations, and obviously, nations that we're familiar with, is what we're going to look at here. So, forgive me. We're going to begin looking at the nation state, the what, the how, the why, and the where. Now, when we're talking about the nation state, the where is often the most straightforward part, because we can look at a map, and maps have lines on them, and we can distinguish something from something else. Often, maps are very helpfully coloured, so we can see differentiated colour. So that gives us a clear about, or an idea about the where. But the what, the how, and the why, this is something that we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about. So our initial challenge for today is I'd like you to take on board this code, go to Menti or QR code it, and enter 3 words addressing the question, what do you understand by the nation? Okay, so let's take a couple of moments just to share some initial thoughts on what we think the nation is. Okay, everyone got that? I get a few nods, waves. Making sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Just making sure. So yeah, take 2 minutes. So 17 minutes past. Think, what do you understand by the nation? Okay. just come off the share for a moment. Back. Okay. One more minute. Hello to everyone who joined a smidge after. Good to see you. Thanks for joining. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see the word cloud that is being formed around what we understand by the nation. Take a few moments more if everyone has the opportunity. So unity seems to be fairly strongly there. Geographical culture, shared identity, history, belonging, identity, territory, language, identity. Okay. Thank you all for sharing that. I just want to open the floor. What strikes you about the words that you see there? What do they suggest that nations are? Perhaps think about some of the words that are there that perhaps are different from the ones that you used. What do we understand by the nation? Okay. Well, I appreciate it can be quite a daunting challenge, and you would not be alone in that. No, Masur, please.
Yes, thank you, Professor. I would say a group of people who believe they have a common backgrounds and they share same destiny,
Okay.
and they have some shared history or language or religion even to create such a nation.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing. Certainly, there's lots that you have contributed there that you could find in any international relations textbook. I think a couple of thoughts on my behalf. One is that the words that you're using here are very familiar to scholars of international relations. So there are elements of the nation that are often common in university academic style definitions, but they are not absolutely universal. And this is where there are contested spaces. In other words, not everyone agrees what a nation is. We can look at different examples of that. We can look at in the United Kingdom's case, is Wales a nation? Well, they are in many regards. They have their own rugby team, which they're very proud of. They have their own language. They have many individual cultural experiences that bind Welsh colleagues together. There is their own history. However, constitutionally, within the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, they are not a nation. They are part of the United Kingdom. These are the kinds of example that give rise to much contention in international affairs. We can look at examples in the way, for example, the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s disintegrated from one nation state, Yugoslavia, into its constituent parts, and still 30 years later, that is highly contentious. So Slovenia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Kosovo, Macedonia, North Macedonia. And again, whether you have an intimate knowledge of these places or not, that's not at stake. But what this does demonstrate is how difficult it is to understand what constitutes a nation in relation to other parts of international affairs and international society. Because there are lines that have been drawn on maps, and many of those maps, as I suggested in the first of these classes, were drawn by individuals sat in smoke-filled offices in London or Paris or Berlin or Brussels, and not by the people who were being those lines were being subjected to. Now, in many regards, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is also a good example of this. The borders around the nation that many of you sit in today were drawn at the end of a conflict that happened many thousands of miles away from the kingdom to assuage other geopolitical concerns. Now, for the best part of 100 years, those borders have held up, as they have held up in other places. But that is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the whole history of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So your ancestors, as mine, existed before we had those lines on the maps. And so we really need to think long and hard about what constitutes the nation. So for the next little bit of the class, I'm going to spend time doing just that. So let us take a closer look at what the nation state, and national interest are. So start, for want of starting somewhere, with what we consider national interest to be. And I refer here to, and I'm going to mention a bunch of books and literature here that comes very much from the field of international relations, as that discipline, that discourse, that conversation about nations has been central to its existence since the academic study of it began in the aftermath of the First World War. And Scott Birchall is a leading scholar in this regard, and I offer up his book here, mindful that it gives just an insight. That's all I'm suggesting. It's by no means the final word, as subsequent slides will share. But what it does capture is those different interpretations. So a realist view of national interest looks at the power that a state has, often in terms of hard power, military power, financial resource, to ensure the state can survive. And it does that because states need to be able to survive in an anarchical realm. The world is a rough place out there, and unless you're armed, you're in danger. The realist view. A liberal view of national interest sees the benefit of cooperation and the mutually interdependent world that we exist or may exist in. So it suggests that national interests are things that can be written across time, space, and culture. We value, as we did previously in talking about governance and law, many of the same things, wherever we come from. Murder is a bad thing. So we share many of those same values, and we can build and foster that trust between organizations, in this case nations, that have those similar understandings. So that's the liberal view, that there's opportunity to cooperate. An alternative view, Marxist view, and again, don't dwell too much on the sort of theoretical alternatives, but simply that there are different interpretations. That there are joint interests across the world that have nothing to do with nations, but everything to do with people. The workers need to have much more in common with each other than they do in their differences. And then a constructivist view would suggest that national interest is something that can be built, manipulated, changed, and that we need to understand how things are socially constructed. So that's the relationships that we have across different parts of the landscape. How do we engage with different parts of the world to enable us to understand it more fulsomely? Now, these are just 4 ways, if you look at the realist, the liberal, Marxist, and constructivist views. And again, this isn't the test, as it were, but simply to recognize that there are different interpretations of what national interest is. And because of that, we have different expressions of national interest at different times and in different contexts. So to go back to the United Kingdom's example, at times, people who live in the same street, in the same geographic space of Wales, for example, are part of the United Kingdom, and at other times, in other contexts, they are Welsh. So wherever there's the contest between those two identities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next time when we explicitly address identity. But to sort of trail it here we're talking about the national expression of that. And that's something that we need to recognize, as it will have implications for our world of sport. Does anyone have any questions? I appreciate it's quite a lot of thought process, so I'll let you just cogitate for a moment. And I will acknowledge, because it's significant, that what I've just shared with you does not take into consideration all the opportunities. And if one looks at the international relations scholars, rather than just the individuals, but the scholarship they produce, for example, it doesn't play or consider the role of race and colonialism in understanding our current interpretations of the modern state system, which is a proxy for nations. And therefore, there is something about decolonizing international relations, which has a challenge to the nation state as it does to the world of sport. And what I'm asking you to do here, gently and kindly, is deconstruct and reconstruct your thinking. What is it that makes up your appreciation of the nation? And whilst I would offer that much of that literature and understandings comes from a white, Eurocentric, Anglicized, possibly, dimension, and those attitudes to race, particularly difference, are there, it also applies to gender and how we conceive of and understand issues of gender. In a little bit more depth. So again, having made the point about gender, I'm now going to quote 3 or 4 gentlemen who act as essentially founding fathers of understanding the nation. Okay, so this image is of a piece of work by a long dead scholar thinker called Thomas Hobbes, who talks of the Leviathan. And essentially, this is a book about power. It's from a long time ago. Okay, so it suggests that humans, all of us, are rational and smart, and that we have to manage resources, and we have to have more resources than other people. It is a war of all against all. I'm only strong because you're weak. Okay, it's a pretty brutal understanding of the world. It's why you build castles, why you stockpile weapons, because your strength and your ability to use that strength demonstrates your power. two other gentlemen, at least in the case of Machiavelli, who thought in these terms. So Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince, which again is all about how the prince claims his power. And Thucydides, who wrote about conflicts in the Peloponnesian Wars, that's in ancient Greece. They are all authors who came through a process of being on the winning side, if you like, and had the privilege of sharing their interpretation of power because they won. I've generalized. This is how we understand the history of our nation. That goes back to one of the points that was made very well on the word cloud, that shared common history. Well, if we're reading the same common histories over many generations, then those values become embedded in our thinking. A more recent tome, Hans Morgenthal's The Politics Amongst Nations. And here he's talking about that struggle, that inherent struggle for power and peace. And it's considered a Bible of realist thought. Okay? How do you manage those relationships among nations? It's a long book. I won't ask you to read it, but it gives you an understanding of how national interest is power and power amongst others. So my power, I mean, I have demonstrably some power this afternoon, this evening with you. I get to click the slides. Okay, that's my power on this occasion. But that's framed by a context. It's framed by my position, privileged position as your class teacher this afternoon. It's privileged by some of the things that I've spent perhaps longer studying than you have up to this point. And all of those aspects of power one can utilize to understand how we represent our nation. And in that sense, what we're looking at here, and the English language, which we should be mindful of, dominates in this discourse. And I'd be fascinated to know if these nuances, or indeed lack of nuance, come through in other languages, particularly Arabic, as to whether we're dealing with international politics or international relations. And international scholars, international relations scholars would spend hours on this. We're not going to. But I pose the question as to what is it that we're talking about? It asks us to take that epistemological, i.e. the theory of how we know stuff, and think about it in that way. So that's the invitation. More recently, John Mearsheimer, an American scholar, wrote this book at the turn of the millennia, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And Mearsheimer's argument is that power matters. Power is the key aspect of international affairs. There is no one else who's going to address it other than the nation. States need to be alert because of the security dilemma. That is, what makes me secure might make you less secure. If I stockpile lots of weapons and put them on my border and they're pointing in your direction, that might make me feel very safe. It might make you feel very insecure, forgive me. It's fundamentally based on the fact that people are rational, though, and that they act on the rational basis. And they don't make impulsive, emotional, knee-jerk decisions. I'm sure, in whatever the context, we can see that sometimes individuals do make those perhaps irrational decisions. Okay, so having shared these three tomes from Hobbes, Waltz and Mearsheimer, we see that that's 400 years worth of scholarship, just like that. But there's a lot of commonality. a lot of shared understanding of what power is and who wields it, and its nations. So these things have been around a while, however we've conceived of them, and wherever we adjust their literal or indeed intellectual boundaries, we've seen a lot of them. And the status quo is maintained because of hegemony, i.e. the power over. But I would counter, to provide, food for thought, that human nature is in play here. I don't know if anyone recognizes this image. Please feel free to shout out. It is a famous, indeed infamous piece of artwork by Salvador Dali titled Guernica. Guernica. It is an image of conflict in the Basque country during the Spanish Civil War. And whatever your taste in art, it's not entirely to my taste. It demonstrates conflict, death, and frankly, disaster. So human nature has a role to play in this regard. We do not always act, and we have not always acted, in an entirely rational and clear-cut fashion. So human nature, and this is what realists recognize, to protect against these vagaries, we have to build up armies, we have to protect ourselves. Is this making sense so far? Again, I just want to pause because I'm mindful of how much has been shared.
Yes, Simon.
Thank you. I wonder if anyone recognizes this image. It is a fictional one, but as with much in fiction, sometimes it's a bit too close to the truth. So it's taken from a film by the name of Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Caring. Okay. It is a war room, a US war room, with the fictional president to the right-hand side talking to his Russian counterpart on the telephone. And the proposition is that we are about to enter into a nuclear exchange at the height of the Cold War, which means that essentially the world that you and I now inhabit would have ceased to exist. Mutually assured destruction. Mad. And as a cultural expression of that, the magazine, Mad, the satirical American comic, putting together mutually assured destruction, is an example of taking realism to the final degree. The only way to ensure that there is no threat is to have no existence, because there is risk in everything. So we can see, and again, as useful backdrop to our point, the nation of the Soviet Union in the backdrop there. And again, we don't have to be historians of Soviet era international affairs, but we can recognize now, and not least because there are considerable challenges to sovereignty in the former Soviet space, that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was made up of 13 republics, including Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, and they are issues of international security in the contemporary world. So this is to demonstrate the timeline that maybe 60, 70 years ago, we had one configuration of a nation state, and now we have a different configuration, and that throws up different security challenges to us in different parts of the world. Between the Kingdom and the United Kingdom, we are thousands of miles from the former Soviet Union. But we recognize, not least in the price of fuel at the petrol station, the impact that that conflict has had. Right or wrong, we're all entitled to our opinions. But different conceptions of nationhood are shaping this. I want to add in a further iteration, a further layer to this, in what IR scholars would call neo-realism. So here they are absolutely fixated on the state as being the most important actor. State survival is paramount. It is the thing. It will do anything to survive, like the Matrix. These survival instincts can be balanced off. So my survival may be in the interest of your survival, but that is a zero-sum equation. And by that, I mean my gain is your loss. So I will keep trying to gain as much as possible because it prevents you having it. Okay? So I am really concentrating on winning and being preeminent, hoarding resources. And in this regard, Kenneth Walt's books, The Man, the State and War, provides that foundational understanding. Again, and importantly, you'd recognize the gender dimension to this. It talks about man and not people. But it provides a structure in understanding how nations exist in an anarchical world. But what we also recognize, and this is where we see the contemporary space, is that while states are important, they are not the only relevant actor. So the state in itself has been decentralized to an extent. There are many things that nation states used to do that they don't do anymore. Okay, in large parts of the world, they used to conscript large armies from the population. In many parts of the world, they don't do that now. Some still do, of course. And that not all states are the same. So if you are, Tuvalu in the South Pacific, are you the same? Do you have the same access to power as the United States? Short answer, no. But you're both states, you're both nations. What we've also seen is how other actors have joined the nation state. We think back to the formation of many recent, or the nation state. We can trace it back to, and I won't dwell on this, a series of treaties in Central Europe in 1648, the Treaties of Westphalia, for reference, if you're interested. And they decided that we would recognize what's over there as someone else's business. And that idea is very much integral to the United Nations. Non-interference. Article 7 talks about nations not having the right to intervene in the affairs of others. But these other actors, be they multinational corporations, non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and indeed individuals, have joined the nation on the international stage. Again, I'm just going to pause, but I want to just give you opportunity, and I'm mindful that I've been speaking for sort of half an hour or so, maybe a bit longer than that, on what constitutes the nation. And I have barely mentioned sport. So let's just pause at that point, look at that slide, and then I will flick to one that I've shown you before and ask you to make the connections that you see as valuable between an understanding of what the nation is in this image, represented by two prime minister or prime minister and a president, and the other actors on this stage, multinational corporation, intergovernmental organization, subnational organizations. So in really getting you to drive at what we understand by the nation, the last half an hour has been thinking about our understanding of how one of the central actors in our world of sport is shaped and understood and then impacts others. Okay. Hopefully that point is well made, or at least well received, if it wasn't well made. So, does anyone have any questions? Okay. Let me take you back to the late summer of 2012 and share a picture of yours truly stood outside Buckingham Palace at the end of the 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. And I'm mindful that to return to this, to give you the opportunity to just think about the pomp and circumstance, the representation of the Olympic moment and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland that those flags represent. And again, I'm just going to flick to, I believe I shared this with you previously, but if I haven't, let me just go back to it. And again, I'm happy to reinforce the point. Here we see the agency and structure in international affairs come to part. So to go back to the initial image I showed you of players from all those nations and then the flags, this is another way of representing that. The image on the left-hand side is of Greg Hartung. He was vice chair of the International Paralympic Committee. He was a really significant actor, albeit in the shadows, if you like, not necessarily front page news, in London 2012 because of his position. And then on the right-hand side, I share 4 flags in the center of that image. So the International Paralympic Committee, the United Nations flag, the LOCOG flag, and the United Kingdom's Union Jack. And within the world of sport, we see those 4 aspects come together. So an organization designed for the benefit of disabled Paralympic athletes. The United Nations, the world's preeminent state-based organization, state-based, note. LOCOG, a business, a project management exercise, an organizing committee. And the United Kingdom's Union Jack, which you may be familiar with to a greater or lesser extent. It's not a test by any stretch, but is already a composite flag of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, all meshed onto each other. So this is to demonstrate the agency and structure that we see in the world of sport that replicates and is informed by and shapes the world of international affairs. So I'm now going to just talk to what is a subject very close to my heart in understanding sport diplomacy amongst nations. So I'm just going to leave that there for you to read for a moment. I'm going to grab a mouthful of water. Hopefully everyone's had the chance to read that. Now, I'm very happy to address any questions you may have in this space, and we'll take this forward. But I'm going to seek to add some further flavour to our understanding of nations by exploring this concept of sports diplomacy, which reflects very much my areas of research expertise, as a means to understanding how different nations are able to pursue different aspects of their sporting identity, their governance, and their ethical values. So, first question to ask is, why does this matter? And my answer, being a good sport diplomat matters because it allows for impact and engagement. It's cost effective. It's not cost neutral, but it is cost effective. It allows us to build out communities of practice across nations and within nations. It allows for aspects of conflict resolution, whether that's conflict resolution at a meta scale where there's armed conflict, or simply resolution of differing perspectives. It can produce significant non-sport outcomes, so those in health and education. And because there is a fixture list, there is an intangible quality of hope. Okay. So perhaps just keep those in mind as we jog forward. So what does this effective sport diplomacy look like once you've agreed that it matters? Well, you need to train hard. You need to invest. So you need to be prepared for what comes next. We need to have a really good understanding of our capabilities and be ready to identify areas for development, because nobody has this absolutely nailed down, if you like. We need to be prepared to leverage our cultural assets. So what is it that makes your opportunity to perform sport diplomacy? What is it that you have in your locker that the other actors on the international stage don't? Equally, thinking about your qualities of allyship. What qualities do they bring, and how can you address, access, support that? And across this piece, where are the stakeholders? What do they think? And finally, but not finally, this is a process that goes back around. The négociation continuelle. We're continually in a process of training, effectively. Now, I particularly pause here and ask us to recognise that when we're talking about much of this, we're essentially in the business of winning and winning over others. But equally, we can see the value of cooperation, the allyship, the stakeholder engagement. There is therefore a contest, if you like, in this space between cooperation and conflict. Are we trying to win? Are we trying to compete? The thing about sport and why it is so fascinating in this contest is you need to be able to compete against others. You need other people in the conversation. So you might be winning, but you need opposition. Otherwise, it's simply performance. So you have to be able to reconcile those two things. So I'm going to share sport diplomacy in 4 dimensions, 4 concepts, 4 practices. And again, I invite you to just take a moment to read these. So over the course of the next 8 slides, at least, I'm going to share a little bit more depth about these, not least because they help us understand what we are representing, what we are communicating with, and how we are negotiating the spaces around us. So that triumvirate: communication, representation, and negotiation. And in the images, the photographs on this slide, you can see how certain organizations are enabling, facilitating, indeed leading some of the communication, negotiation, and representation of nation states. So the top left image is from Pyeongchang 2018, the opening of the 2018 Winter Olympic Games. And the gentleman in the bottom left of the picture is Thomas Bach, who was then president of the IOC. And his diplomacy, his Olympic diplomacy, brought together representatives of South Korea and North Korea, 2 countries that are still technically at war with each other. They are contesting that space very much. So here we see how sport, as one of those actors, is influencing and shaping nation-state behavior. Equally, we see how nation-states are shaping sports behavior. So this two-way relationship between nations and sport is, and I'm sure not to your surprise, what matters in this context. The image on the top right is now 8 years old. Oh, wow. From the 2018 World Cup final in Moscow, where President Macron of France is celebrating his nation's 3rd goal, I believe, next to the president of Croatia, who is sat down, the blonde lady sat down to his right. To his left, Gianni Infantino, and to his left, Vladimir Putin. Now, all of these individuals represent different organizations, not just the difference between France and Croatia, but an international sporting federation, a host nation, and 2 competing countries. But if Croatia hadn't turned up that day, France wouldn't have been able to claim a famous victory. They might have been given the trophy, but the reality is that they were there, they needed that opposition. So much of this work on sport diplomacy has been captured in some literature. I recommend Stuart Murray's book, Sport Diplomacy: Origins, Theories and Practice, and something that I did back in the day. But what this suggests is that sport diplomacy is at least part of how we conceive of the nation, because it asks us to think about things that happen, that impact and are impacted by nations. So under the premise of those 3 core characteristics of representation, negotiation, and communication, sport diplomacy provides the navigation skills to connect with and learn from, and space for critical reflection from all of those different actors. And if we look at that as a piece of conceptual contribution to a discourse, and whether you agree with me or not, and you're very welcome not to, of course, that was 2019. And you will see from the slide I shared a little while ago that my thinking has evolved. It has moved on. You might prefer this version. You might prefer the more recent version. But it demonstrates the iterative qualities of our thinking. And as a function of that, the different qualities of understanding the nation state. You've seen this certainly. I won't dwell on it, but just that it's there in one dimension. Good afternoon, Nuf. Good to see you. Good to join.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody.
The governance question we've looked at, the ethics dimension, questions of sustainability, the diplomats in tracksuits, and again, I'm going to come on to that again in a little bit. I'd again dwell on the convening power of sport, how that talks to all of the different ways in which sport is brought together and the opportunities that that gives us. Concept A. Sport has the power to change the world. It's a slide I've shown you before, but again, I make no apologies for sharing it once again. This is really fundamental to our thinking when we think about how nations can utilize sport. It doesn't mean it always happens, but it is a tantalizing prospect, given nations are often seen as, and as the contemporary moment gives us, the World Cup, in national terms. Sport is dynamic, dramatic, emotional. It has that element of negotiation continuelle. These are, again, concepts that mean, in light of the nation state, that we have opportunity. So the portrait here is of, and again, Cardinal Richelieu, who was essentially the first prime minister to his sovereign. So in the middle of the 17th century, he, working for the King of France, who was his sovereign, the all powerful, he organized and ran the first Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He organized the state's affair. He created many of the institutions of state. He was the first person to use that title of Prime Minister. And subsequently, it has stuck and been adopted by many other things that call themselves nation states. And they are recognized as by each other. So this quality of recognition, dwelling on this slide a little bit, is something that's fundamental to how we understand the nation. Nations receive ambassadors from other states because they recognize them as peers. They are the same entity. Of course, they have differences, but they have enough in common to be recognized. The third conceptual dimension, it looks at the networks of sport diplomacy and how many of these run contrary to the nation state because they operate at both sub-state, i.e. below the nation state, and trans-state, i.e. above the nation state. So this is the people-to-people diplomacy, the opportunity for conversations through institutions like higher education, through sport, to network with each other. And my erstwhile boss at London 2012 lauded sport as the best diplomat we have, recognizing his undoubted vested interest in saying that, now as president of an international sporting federation, previously a member of parliament, so wielded some power in the United Kingdom, and as a double Olympic gold medalist. So there's lots of reasons there. Okay. Let us just reflect again, and I suggest we take a couple of minutes of break just to stretch our legs. Let us think about, go back to that question that I posed you 45, 50 minutes ago. What does the nation mean to you, and how do you conceive of it? Okay, let's take 3 or 4 minutes and come back at 10 past the hour if you need to stretch your legs or what have you, and perhaps stay hydrated as I need to. So I'll see you at 10 past in a couple of minutes. Okay. Hello again, folks.
Hello, Simon.
Let us move on. Okay. So before going any further, I just want to share that there were challenges here. I don't want to suggest that understanding nations means that we live in a world of milk and honey. There are distinct challenges, and particularly as it impacts sport, in the way we look at victory and defeat, and the importance of being able to save face or not lose face. And again, that might be some nuance to the English language, which I would acknowledge. And George Orwell's article, The Sporting Spirit, I thoroughly recommend, and I hope translates as well as it is written in English. But what this suggests is that conflicts between different entities, and that therefore includes nations, can be impacted, maximized by the sporting contest. If we think back to what I shared about realism, the contest of my win is your loss, the zero-sum equation. And much of sport is based on someone winning over someone else. So whether that's in an individual sport, whether it's maybe a game of chess you play with your child, or two nations slugging it out in the World Cup final, there is someone who will win, someone who will lose. And we have to be able to contend with the space of what happens when that happens. So the how, the what, the why, and the where. How does that happen? And what happens next? And even within the space of international affairs, where you might think that people have thought routinely about the consequences of this, sport hasn't always been at the forefront of thinking. Sport has been, in the UNHCR's words, relatively untapped as recently as 2018. Why would the UNHCR, dealing with humanitarian crises, deal with sport? Well, much of the literature on sport for development will tell you how sport can be a reconciliatory moment. It can provide alternative ways of dealing with disaster relief, and the mental and physical well-being of those in positions of extreme danger are certainly to the fore in this space. So thinking about how you put that together, that is clearly part of what your what sport offers. But it comes with our understanding of where we see the nation state fitting into this. Now, I particularly at this point want you to think about your context. Okay. So the environments in which you work, both in the kingdom and in the various entities that you represent, how much of this that I've shared resonates? How much of it can you see applying to perhaps this sport? How much of it can you see applying to peer nations or peer sports in the neighborhood, in the GCC or wider Arab world? How much of this is something that's unique to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? How much of it do you think could be transposed into the United Kingdom? These are the kind of questions, and I want to, offer, invite your contribution here what does this look and feel like on behalf of your experiences and your context in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? So perhaps just make a couple of notes. I'm going to give you the opportunity to come back and share a couple of examples that might, again, further help prompt that thinking. And just spend a little bit of time thinking about your particular example. Okay. So this is where we get to talk about our diplomats in tracksuits. So I'm going to talk about a country which is neither of ours, Slovenia. Okay. It's about halfway between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia. And it is blessed by a number of leading world-class athletes. And here we see the likes of Luka Doncic wearing his Slovenia jersey as opposed to his LA Lakers jersey. We see the double Olympic world champion in bouldering. We see the former Slovenian captain of an NHL Las Vegas Knights. No, Las Vegas. I've lost the name of the Las Vegas team. Anyone help me? In the NHL. He played for them. And Tadej Pogacar, who's about to begin the defense of his Tour de France title. And this is a small country. It has a population of about 2 million individuals. It's tightly packed into a bit of Europe. It was formerly part of the Yugoslavia, which was part of, at various times, the Eastern Bloc, part of the non-aligned movement, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, going back a little further. All of these are labels that are applied to this same geographic space. And it changes the way that we look at and can represent the people who live there. So therefore, thinking about how we look at these athletes, and we could go to other parts of the world and look at their athletes, if you like. What does that mean to how we understand the nation? And with the greatest respect to other Slovenians, maybe you know the Slovenian Prime Minister's name. Maybe you know Slovenia's greatest musical composer. Maybe you know their greatest literary giant. I must confess I don't. But I do know that they have, for example, in Tadej Pogacar, possibly the world's best ever cyclist. We'll see, but he's going pretty well so far. And that is a remarkable thing to be able to associate with your nation. So, again, whether Mr. Pogacar wants to or not, he represents something that is significant over and above his cycling talents because of the nation he is from. Some other examples. I've mentioned Wales before. I'm happy to go back there, not least as that's where I studied to do my PhD. So here we see two Welsh footballers and another cyclist. Let's start with the cyclist, Geraint Thomas, who won the Tour de France in 2018. Welshman, very proud Welshman, has represented Wales in other events, but also is a double Olympic gold medalist on behalf of Team GB. On the left-hand side, no, let's go back, is a female footballer by the name of Jess Fishlock. She scored more goals in international football than any other player, male or female. She very recently retired from her time as a professional athlete, which took her to lots of different corners of the world. And then we see Gareth Bale on the left-hand side, relatively recently retired footballer, playing for Wales and Real Madrid. Now, the extent to which his identity, prelude to next time, looks at whether he's Welsh or, in some sense, a Madrista. And over and above his individual preference, possibly for playing golf rather than playing for Madrid, this gives rise to different forms of national identity. In many regards, the institution that is Real Madrid, the preeminent European football champion, is possibly a more important identity to many people around the world than the nationality of the players who represent it. These are the kinds of issues that I and colleagues Stuart Murray and Gavin Price, who authored this report towards a Welsh sport diplomacy strategy, talk to when we think about what it means to represent Wales, what it means to represent a nation. And it's certainly fair to say that our Welsh colleagues think of Wales as a nation, even if the United Kingdom, with some contest, doesn't. So it's this back and forth that is A, so fascinating, and B, gives rise for us to think about what is the place of the nation in our sporting landscape. Another version, looking at Ireland and New Zealand, both of whom have shared interpretations of their place in the world, if you like. They're both very much able to perform on an international stage in various sports. New Zealand almost synonymously with their male rugby team, the All Blacks. And they point to, going back to the structural dimensions of sports affairs, those parts of the New Zealand architecture, so a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, yeah, you can see that. Trade and enterprise, okay. Investment, yeah. Tourism. Education, okay. Story Group, don't know a lot about that. Business, innovation and employment, ministries being called different things. The Ministry for Cultural Heritage, reflecting how so much of New Zealand history is shaped by that, often difficult history. And last but by no means least, so the last organisation on that list as responsible for sport and the nation is the Sport Ministry. Looking at the Irish example as well, what does it mean to raise the bar on Ireland's global ambition in terms of a sport diplomacy strategy? So this is work that I've been involved with, as I say, and it shapes the way that we see our nations and nations see us, whatever country we're from. There are other perhaps longer standing examples. The French, certainly in the lead up to the 2024 Paris Paralympic Games, developed a diplomatie sportive approach, starting with the Rugby World Cup in 2023 and then into the Paris Games. The United States is a fascinating example in and of itself. The degree to which the current administration engages in this, fascinating. We will see some sport diplomacy on behalf of the United States, as espoused by Mr. Trump, come the final of the World Cup for sure. It was announced yesterday that he will be present and indeed delivering the trophy to the players who ultimately end up winning the tournament. And as it were, the grandfather of sport diplomacy strategies, Australia, who were the first to articulate this in 2015. Some examples that reflect the nation and the way to do sport diplomacy. The Australian example was then revisited. And even in the images on that, you can see as it were, Australian version, there aren't necessarily Australian tops in that or kits. There are some, but it also reflects how many different cultural values that a sport diplomacy strategy can entail. And it talks about, to use a word that I have used previously today, power. That's how you're going to, you're increasing, strengthening Australian national power through sport. And that's because if you look at the constituent parts and recognizing that different governments do things differently, take a moment to just read not necessarily the names of the MPs involved, but the ministries they represent. So, international development, for the defence industry and capability, the Minister for Aged Care, and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. That's quite a understanding of the nation state. And by way of contrast, if you were to look at the United Kingdom and the sport diplomacy strategy that we've drafted, it would be presented on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Department for Business and Trade, and DCMS, that's Department for Culture, Media and Sport. But that's just to focus on the nation state. Here I want to just look at, very briefly, the United Nations and how that has gone about it. So if you're thinking here about whether the state is the appropriate dimension, what else? And here, again, don't dwell on the details, it's not fundamental, but look here at the overview, the ownership of sport. So from the Kazan Action Plan, which is was found in 2017, sports ministers represented governments, UN, IGOs, sports organizations, NGOs, and academia. So that's another way of expressing the slide that I've shown you before of President Xi and David Cameron. The slide that I shared today with McDonald's and Bill Gates on, it's all of these actors other than just states. And again, this is something of a messy slide. So again, the detail is, you can talk to. And there were bits of government here, in the case of the United Kingdom. But amongst all of these organizations that are developing, practicing, thinking about sport diplomacy, there are only 3 nations on here. Your near neighbors in Qatar, South Korea, and Croatia. And then there's some international organizations, the Organization of American States, UNESCO. There are some sub-national organizations. UK is from the Basque Country. The Harry Potter-esque seal is the City of London. UK Anti-Doping, an agency of the UK government. But then there's some transnational ones, like the OAS and UNESCO, but also the European Union. So this is to demonstrate that nation states have to essentially compete on the airwaves in sport as they do in other parts of international life. The European Union's version, the European Commission, European Union's version, as funded by the Commission, has a little bit about sport diplomacy in a project that I worked on a couple of years ago, and articulates sport diplomacy as a transnational effort. So our project surveyed the 27 member states of this organization to see how they did their sport diplomacy and the different variations that gave us. So it was fascinating to think about in that regard. And again, as prelude to things to come, think about how sporting events represent the nation. Now, this is an image very familiar to me as someone who grew up in this country. But this bridge, and again, often confused with London Bridge, is iconic. It gives a clear sense of something that is British. It's not unproblematic, etc. At this point, it's adorned by the Olympic ring, so it becomes, quasi property of the International Olympic Committee also. But it says something about the nation. Again, much we could discuss. And sport provides other ways of looking at the nation. So a little while ago, I spoke to North and South Korea. Here, one athlete from North Korea, one athlete from South Korea present a flag which just has Korea. It takes away the North and the South and just looks at Korea in a UN pale blue. Let me just pause on that one. Let me go back there. I'll come to that in a moment. So I just want to check in. How is this going down? Does anyone have any questions? Please, Masood.
Yes, I just noticed, is this the full Korean island? And the
It is
flag?
the full Korea. Korea is more of a peninsula. I'm not
Or
a
on peninsula?
mapper.
Yeah,
But yeah, the more it's if you joined essentially North Korea and South Korea together, which given that we use the terms North and South Korea. No, that's the People's Republic of Korea and the
exactly.
Democratic Republic of Korea. So
Yes,
my shorthand has already changed in some senses that understanding of nation. North and South is a very easy way to look at it in the English language, which again may be a cultural predilection that I am exposed to and replicating in that regard. And the fact these two nations are technically at war. There is no peace treaty between Punjab and Seoul. There is an armistice. Now, I'm not an international lawyer, but they are different entities, a treaty and an armistice. An armistice stops a conflict, a treaty resolves it. Well, there is no resolution. It is the most heavily fortified border in the world, and it is mutually recognized. But because we mutually recognize it, it exists. We could use this flag instead of the flags that we might typically see when we see, as I did on one of the previous slides, South Korea and the red, blue and red flag that is the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. So it matters how we view nationhood, and sport views it in very different ways. I think I maybe have shared, because it's one of my sort of go-to stats, but I'm happy to share it again. If you look at the United Nations has 193 member states. The International Volleyball Association has 212 members. How can you have another 19 members of an organization that represents volleyball that doesn't represent states on the world? And if you do a desk exercise, which sometimes I ask students to do, the sport that you're most engaged with, how many member states does it have? I would hazard a guess. Well, we've got 8 people on the call. If we have 8 different sports represented, there will be 8 different numbers. And maybe one will coincide with the membership of the United Nations. Now, it's not for me, or possibly maybe it is for yourselves, but it's certainly not for me to say that the United Nations is right and the International Swimming Federation is wrong. Basic arithmetic allows us to count. But the value we place in giving nationhood through sport, and sport can be a very key way of expressing this. So I share the example of Kosovo. Again, somewhere you may not have come across, but a former part of the Yugoslavia, made up of a different ethnic group from Serbia. And when Yugoslavia existed after the Second World War up to the 1990s, it was one of many republics within that organization, number of republics. But as Yugoslavia disintegrated and Slovenia went its own way, Bosnia through much conflict, etc., Kosovo ended up still within Serbia, essentially, or being run by Belgrade, by the Serbian-led national government. And Kosovans weren't very happy about this. Again, there's conflict, armed conflict, supported by NATO. So significant military hardware was in play. But Kosovo pursued a very clear path to nationhood. And you can admire or critique it in equal measure. But as part of their recognition, or their quest for recognition, their football team was a very proactive part of that. Their men's football team, let me be clear also. And they went about organising fixtures, even while the conflict was still ongoing, and importantly, getting recognition of those fixtures. So Kosovo played its first game against Germany, a significant international player. Okay, there's a history there. Again, don't go back into the trials of the Second World War and 19th century European history, but there was some history. Germany and Kosovo played a game. Germany recognised Kosovo to do that. The Kosovan national anthem, the Kosovan flag, these were symbols of Kosovo that Germany recognised. So prompted by that, and given Germany's recognition, UEFA, the governing body of European football, recognised Kosovo. I'm missing out a few details, but let me just give you the broad brush history here. And because UEFA had given Kosovo recognition, FIFA gave Kosovo recognition. And because FIFA had given Kosovo recognition, the United Nations, essentially, there's a bit of diplomacy, as you'll appreciate, in between, gave Kosovo recognition. So over the course of 4 years, what was part of Serbia, utilised a very clear strategy of recognition through mainly its men's national football team. And Kosovo joined the family of nations. It's an interesting example of how sport recognition can impact other parts of international affairs and what it takes to have national recognition. Mansur, does that help?
Yes, but I would assume these guys are from South Korea, right?
There's one South Korean, one North Korean.
Oh,
So this was a joint endeavor and again, this speaks to the power of sport. At the 2018 opening ceremony, their athletes walked in together under this Korean flag. So on the back of their jersey, of their coats there, it was very cold. It doesn't say People's Republic and Democratic People's Republic, it just says Korea.
interesting.
So sport can recognize the Korea in a way that other nations would find it far more difficult to address. I mean, Henry Kissinger, who was US Secretary of State under Nixon and what have you, he famously said about the European Commission, who do you call? Who do you pick up the phone to? Because it's all very well having this idea of Europe, but who do you actually speak to? If you were to want to call Korea, where do you ring Pyeongchang or Seoul? So this is to sort of challenge that idea that, well, because it was drawn on a map, that's the country. Well, the map can change. Human agency allows you to redraw the map. Bearing in mind, for what have we been on the planet? 10,000 years, human beings? We've only really had maps for about 300, 400, maybe 500 years. Did our ancient ancestors need maps? Or did they just do what they did? Okay? So the nation is a new concept. Yeah. And because of that, it's both an organizing principle and challenged by the world of sport. So there's lots to think about here, okay? And particularly in many of the roles that you have and the geographic location that you exist in, and indeed I do, we default to the nation state very simply. Many of the organizations you represent and the collective students on here are the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's Football Association, Olympic Committee, ice hockey, whatever it may be. So, that's what we do. But I would just, in the course of the last hour and a half or so, ask you to question how those things come about, because whilst in the Kingdom's case, it might be very straightforward, if you're in Korea, it's not necessarily. And there are other examples, the Kosovo one. We could talk about Taiwan and how Taiwan is seen in the United Nations as opposed to how it's seen in the IOC. So sport has a role to play in this, and we are collectively those diplomats in tracksuits, whether we are athletes or not, because when we put on that national jersey, as some of you on the call obviously have, we are representing that identity, which is by way of sort of seamless segue to next week's lecture. But I wanted to just offer you the opportunity, as I said, I'm going to skip through that, to think about what successful sports diplomacy looks like and how that might work for you and your organization. So the idea of strategizing, I think, is undoubtedly something that works. The idea, which we are participants in from different perspectives, to train, support, and develop your people. Recognizing the value of small actions at a local level. So thinking about what your agency is to be a sports diplomat. Working together as a peer. Recognizing those multi-stakeholder engagement, and to lean into the language of the Sustainable Development Goals, because of the multiple access points that sport provides, to engage in partnerships for our goals. Okay. Now, an extra point. Imagine, I won't take up too much more of your time, but the lecture has gone into extra time. And I invite you, as I did 15, 20 minutes ago, whatever it was, to think about what this looks like in your context. So, as if you were writing this as a case study of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and you'll have seen images like this, I'm sure. What would that look like for you? I'm going to stop my share. Maybe if we could just share a few thoughts. Anything anyone would like to add, augment, question, query, see what that might, how that might sit. Talal, please.
Yes, hi Simon. I have actually a question and one thought. I wanted to go back to your slide about the New Zealand. So
Yeah.
can we see about the sport diplomacy part of presenting a new definition about the nation, or educate other about your what they call it. I think especially the Haka dance.
Yes, yeah.
I think they bring it to the sport, right? And they
Correct.
saw it maybe in different. This is part of how we can define diplomacy in sport?
So what the New Zealand All Blacks always perform it, and other sports as well. So within their female rugby team, they perform this haka, a dance, which has a deep tribal cultural value in New Zealand society amongst the indigenous people of that island. Those islands, forgive me. The experience of indigenous New Zealanders over the course of the last 200, 300 years has been fundamentally influenced by British, European, and now more global influences. But this particular act has been preserved. It's essentially a war dance. Before tribes would go to war, they would perform this ritual dance. I don't understand. I don't have as it were, an intimate knowledge of it, but it's that value is deeply ingrained in New Zealand society, and so therefore it is become an opportunity to challenge others. So as the sport of rugby was introduced into New Zealand, and an opportunity to challenge the imperial powers, i.e. those countries that made up the United Kingdom in the first instance, it became a way of throwing down the gauntlet, of expressing value and challenging these people who live halfway around the world and now own our lands. So it has adopted that value, which was not the intended value of ancient New Zealand peoples who did it for a different reason. But sport has become intertwined in that relationship, and particularly the sport of rugby, because for lots of very interesting reasons, if you follow the sport, New Zealand's male rugby team is possibly the most successful sports team ever. They've won more of their fixtures than any other sports team by a long way. In recent years, they've actually dropped off a little, which is another interesting dynamic. But I think it's something I'm going to get this slightly wrong, but I think between 2010 and 2020, they lost 4 games out of the 200 they played. Happened to be a couple of World Cup finals, but which they won't care for me to remember. But that was, just phenomenally successful, and generations of players. So almost as soon as they started playing the game in the late 19th century, they were the best team in the world. And for 100+ years, they've been the best team in the world. So this symbol, their haka, has become synonymous with that. So on the basis of, my recommendation of what constitutes good sport diplomacy, you leverage your cultural assets. This is a cultural asset on behalf of New Zealand. It is something that helps define their culture and their rugby team. Now, whether it leads to victory on the pitch, it's a bit more difficult in recent times, but it's been ingrained into international sport. The governance of rugby allows New Zealand to do this. The English team doesn't have an equivalent. We don't, do some Morris dancing and back at it. Okay. So it's just the New Zealand team. There are different versions amongst different South Pacific islands that have other forms of ritual dance, but not, the other teams that play rugby. Argentina, South Africa, France, Scotland. They don't have their traditional cultural value expressed on a sporting field before an international context. So again, you look at why and how New Zealand have been allowed to do the haka, and other teams aren't allowed to express their cultural values. Now, at this point, it's very well ingrained, and if the International Rugby Board, which is the governing body, tried to stop New Zealand doing it, that would be odd as much as anything, because it adds to the spectacle and what have you. But it is a unique feature, to a large extent, of New Zealand rugby, and therefore that image was, both very obvious and culturally relevant to put on the front of their strategy document. So you might think, and it's a question to owners, like, what image would you put on the front of the Saudi sport diplomacy strategy to share that same sort of cultural value? You can do that. But that, what would it look like on the front of the British one? Maybe a picture of Wimbledon, maybe a picture of, Lord's cricket ground, maybe a picture of David Beckham. What is it, the values that you're integrating into saying something about your nation? I'm sure, those of you who've traveled through or been to the United Kingdom, as you arrive at Heathrow, you will see the Britain is Great campaign. And many of those are of, forgive me, it's a slightly sort of raised eyebrow. Britain is great at, cooking. Well, maybe not. Castles, we're good at castles. Got lots of castles. Good at that. Okay, etc., etc. So you can see these different things that you want to share. And sport fits into that. Britain is great at sport. That's what the signs say. So, does that help?
Yes, thank you. And if you don't mind, if I wanted to share my thought before we go to our colleague Bassem. I don't know if it's relevant. The GCC Cup tournament has historically been regarded as one of the most important football tournament in the region, at least. And the funny thing that it wasn't officially recognized by FIFA until recently. So that tournament bring together around, I think, 7 Gulf countries, depend about the year, and generate interest for competition, strong emotion. But at that time, the competition, I can say, it's extend beyond the football itself. So it might actually lead tension and outcomes that are not perceived positively by others.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I wasn't familiar that it was only relatively recently affiliated by FIFA, but I might equally, in some senses, by not being regulated or governed by the International Sporting Federation, it actually allows for a different identity to be formed on behalf of that competition, which speaks to some of the values that you shared, and why perhaps sometimes the International Sporting Federation is not the relevant organization to give power to maybe different stakeholders. Maybe it's important for the Middle East Arab GCC football federations, but maybe not for the fans. They just want to beat their rivals. They don't mind whether Gianni Infantino says it's interesting or not. They're quite happy doing their interpretation of this. So these are the kind of things that always investigate, peel back the curtain, see what's behind it. So thank you for sharing that. It's an interesting one. Bassem, your question.
Thank you, Simon. Actually, this is again very interesting because we are seeing now day after day the sport diplomacy rising everywhere in the world. I was lucky enough to join the Ministry of Sport, and several colleagues and even from this class to go to the United Nations headquarters in Geneva and have a 10 days course covering sports diplomacy. And it was really an eye-opener and amazing to see how really sports is used as what they call today soft power. And then we started, hearing about these new terminologies like sport washing or even the soft power itself. But above all, I think there is something that people don't recognize yet, which is how we are as nations putting everything aside when it comes to sport, and how even some of the biggest gatherings like the World Cup today. Nowadays, you can see many presidents attending, no matter what their political views are, no matter what the conflicts are between the nations. So everything has been set aside. And then what I wanted to ask you really, Simon, is where do you see us going from here? I mean, what's the next level of sports diplomacy? Um, we are in Saudi using this a lot. I mean, we're trying our best to even now create newer IPs, newer events where we are actually using these as platforms to bring everyone with us here in Saudi and let them see what Saudi Arabia is really on the ground with their own eyes. We don't want them to hear it from the media anymore. We don't want them to even give their ears to words of mouth. We want them to come and experience it themselves. So my question to you, where do you see us heading from here? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Basim. I think there's two answers to that. One is that's very much your decision collectively, the nation. The government, who many of you represent, will have a view in and of itself, and of course, His Excellency. But I would also counsel the wider population to engage in that stakeholders, and some of those voices may be difficult to hear. There may be things that there are tensions that certainly are in the United Kingdom, but the value of having and you might not arrive at a common understanding, but you would have been through the process. So if there's an analogy with sport, it's like training for the performance event isn't the same as the performance event. You do a number of things to train. You might do strength and conditioning training. You might do agility. You might do mental agility work to prepare for a performance. Whether you're a footballer or swimmer or cyclist or whatever it may be. And those different components have different skill sets, recognition, and thinking about how you engage that whole process to provide peak performance, whether that's at an elite level or on a Saturday afternoon against your son or daughter, or their performance against you. Those are the things that I think are, that's a really fundamental way to get to understanding, the slide I shared earlier about what effective sport diplomacy looks like and why it's worthwhile. I think having been, working in this space for the last 15, 20 years and having written or helped to write UK sport diplomacy strategy, and having observed and studied and criticised and been critiqued other sport diplomacy approaches, I think that the value of understanding and adopting a strategic thought is really where many countries would benefit. And more countries are thinking like this, which is, I think, adds weight, not only to, just doing it for the sake of it. We can all write a strategy document, put it in a nice folder and put it on a shelf. But we have to be able to live it, which is why I think the sort of concept and the practice need to come together. And that's why, at a very fundamental level, courses like this enable us to think about how we see our societies and our sports role in it operate with, moments of tension, but also leverage, complementarity, benefit, and whether those benefits are realized in, an Olympic medal table or in a reduction of the healthcare bill. They are both worthwhile and many other endeavors that having a sport diplomacy strategy enables. So I would, forgive me if it sounds self-serving because I've spent time working in this space. I think the value of the sport diplomacy strategy and the evaluation that we've done of people who have adopted it is absolutely tantamount. Examples in Wales, particularly, again, it's a small nation, but they had a dedicated plan under different political masters in their strategy, and they followed it through. They've hosted significant events in the likes of the Ryder Cup, the European Champions League final. They've had world-class athletes. But they've now got a legacy to build on those world-class athletes. So Geraint Thomas has retired, Gareth Bale's retired, Jess Fishlock's retired. The prominence of those individuals, those catalysts, has been there, but they're not on the scene anymore. And so when I was in, my interest in Slovenia, I happily confess not only that it's about halfway between our two nations, is I was invited to go there 3 or 4 weeks ago to speak to their Global Slovenia Forum. And, at the moment they have, the world's preeminent cyclist. They have a very significant presence in, the NBA in Luka Doncic. And they have, in a fascinating sport of bouldering, the world, a preeminent world champion there. So, but these people will retire eventually. What do you do about not only creating the next individual sports star, but what legacy can they leave that creates a fundamental identity for Slovenian sports, so that in 20 years' time, when you think of Slovenia, you recognize their sporting achievements, prowess, capabilities over and above the individual athletes who are around today. So that is to say that it's a long-term investment, like many things, but it's a long-term investment on behalf of the kingdom to create a space where its image, its responsibilities, its opportunities are the ones that you are, want to be able to share, and that it's authentic for, those who see it from farther afield and from those who visit. There we go. That's my advice. Take it as you wish.
Thank you, Simon. But don't you also think maybe we could add something like a clear or a straightforward vertical within existing platforms like United Nations when they gather every year, or maybe a special occasion that could cover diplomacy from sports perspective? Don't you think maybe there should be more conferences or an international congress for under the sport umbrella, where it brings everyone from all the nations, including the youth and the next generations?
I mean, I'm individually all for that. I have responsibilities in my day job to create spaces for sport diplomacy to happen and engage with many of those different stakeholders. There are opportunities in this regard. As you went off to Geneva for that sport diplomacy course. We know that colleagues who I work with UNITAR also, we're working on a white paper on sport diplomacy on behalf of the United Nations. We have opportunity to shape and influence the international, transnational space. But I would also urge us to think about the community and grassroots sporting spaces. There's an awful lot of influence that can bring around the necessary cultural circumstances in which sport is received and perceived. And I think that is also a space which shouldn't be neglected. All of which is, suffice to say, there's a lot of work to do. And the more individuals who are able to be engaged, the more courses that we run, the more opportunity we have to host and organize. And, if it's helpful for me, to speak to other colleagues and showcase the world that can exist when we think about what sport can do in a diplomatic space, then I'm, individually very, very happy to do that. And I think I'm not only happy to do it, I'm doing it because it makes a difference. I routinely, and as you'll hear me here again, Nelson Mandela's words, sport has the power to change the world. And I think it does so in a way that is unique to other attributes of global and individual societies that we operate in. So yes, essentially, let's do it.
Thank you, Simon.
No problem. Is there any other questions anyone would like to ask? Is there anything? Okay, well, thank you. Let me finish up by saying thank you again for your submissions of your assignments. I will get to those. We'll take that forward. If there's anything else, please feel free to drop me a line. Other than that, I will look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. 14th, Tuesday the 14th, I think is our next one. No, please. Yeah.
Okay, just final question. Would you prefer, Prof, shall I send you an email because I have a question regarding the next assignment, or make it as a conversation in the platform? Would you usually?
Yeah, let's make it as a conversation, because I'm sure if it's a question that you have,
Yes,
it's a
please.
question that others have as well. So
Sure.
yeah, we
Okay.
can share the answer. Yeah,
Sure.
do that, and
Thank
I'll
you.
get back to you on that.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. Take care, everyone. Inshallah, be well, and we will see each other again in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Professor.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.